They laughed at my cane like it was a joke. It clicked against the linoleum with a kind of rhythm that used to keep time to dances and church hymns. That night, it sounded like a metronome for mockery. The fork that had been in my hand trembled. A glass caught the light and sang, a bright, brittle sound, and someone said, as if tasting it for the first time, "She won't last, you know." My name is Edith Grant. This is a true story from North Carolina. I sat there with my shoulders folded like an old coat and watched a family that had once wrapped itself around me begin to unpick the seams. They smiled while they spoke of my decline. They tapped the cane. They traded grins like cards. You could call it cruelty. Some may call it selfishness. Whatever name you choose, it yawned open between us like a gulf. Where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. I want to know who is listening. Have you ever had someone count the days of your life like coins? That dinner folded away the last of pretenses. The lamplight made everybody's faces look smaller, thinner. My daughter-in-law laughed too loud. My son's laughter had a softer edge, the kind that comes from a man used to keeping his mouth shut until it suits him to open it. The grandchildren pushed peas around their plates, eyes darting between adults when something mean was said, then sliding away, embarrassed for reasons they couldn't name. I had been a different kind of woman once. I remember mornings when the house smelled of coffee and flour, a cat on the back of a chair, my husband humming under his breath as he fixed the fence. We raised our children on Sundays and chicken pot pies and the kind of small talks that bound neighbors. We worked. We loved. We walked down the pier at Wrightsville Beach when the war was still more a rumor than a story, when our pockets held less and our laughter held more. My husband used to say, "Edie, keep your spine straight. People will bend around you better if you stand firm." He's gone now, God rest his soul. Losing him was like losing the lighthouse that made the dark manageable. But I did not lose the shape of myself. The cane came later, a misstep on the front step, a cracked ankle that never quite mended the way it did when you were young. The doctor said to use it for stability. I thought of it as a companion that would keep me upright. Apparently, others saw it as a declaration of my inevitable disappearance. They had been whispering for months. I heard it in the kitchen when plates were stacked too quickly. I heard it in the telephone calls that ended too suddenly. People speak differently when they're weaving a plan. The voice slides into a lower register, as if trying not to wake conscience. It was a conversation about the house, about what would be done with that property when I was no longer able. Do you know that feeling when a room is full of people and you are suddenly very small? You look for a place to anchor yourself, and there is none. My cane tapped like a metronome of time passing. Their jokes were like birds, sudden, noisy, and then gone. But the way they circled left a raw place in me where something alive used to be. At first, I blamed my senses. Widowhood does odd things to the ears. Grief plays tricks. It sharpens everything, then makes you dull the next moment. I tried to laugh along. I even held my fork higher and took bigger bites, like a woman who wanted to show she could still. But when the conversation slid into specifics, costs, timing, we can move her, nursing home would be better for everyone, the laughter had an outline that made it clear. They were talking about removing me, as one might remove a quilt that no longer fits the bed. It is one thing to acknowledge your children's independence. It is another to be discussed like an estate item at a sale. That night, I woke with the taste of metal on my tongue from the leftover anger that had been on my palate all evening. I walked to the window and looked at the road. The moon was a coin over the trees. The cane leaned by the bed, plain as a broom, but to me it was the last argument I had for walking on my own terms. People imagine elder abuse as violence and bruises. Sometimes it is. Sometimes, and more often, it is a slow, polite erosion, the patient minimizing, the careful plotting, the forced helplessness. They had not raised their voices. They whispered, but whispers can be sharp enough to carve bone. I went to the kitchen and made tea. The kettle sang like a small, cheerful engine. I stirred in honey because my hands wanted something to do. I thought of my husband's hands, of the way he would pat my shoulder after a difficult day. Then I thought of the house, the one my husband and I had bought when the neighborhood had been more field than street, where our children learned to ride bikes on the cracked driveway, and where we planted roses that kept surprising us every spring. They wanted that house. I could hear it in the way they said our, as if the house had been a shared commodity rather than the shelter where our family was forged. It stung because I had worked for that house. I had scrubbed, repaired, read by lamplight on winter nights when the pipes ran thin and the bills were a worry. To have it discussed by people who circulated the table like vultures felt like being stripped while still alive. I did something that surprised even me. I stopped pretending my hands were too shaky to reach for the phone. I dialed a number that had been in the bottom drawer of the desk for decades. Samuel Price. He had been our family lawyer for 30 years, a man who handled a will when my mother died and who had once, at our wedding, slipped a card to my husband with an apology for missing the cake. Samuel's voice is steady, the kind of voice that suggests nothing will fall apart if you whisper across the line. "You remember me?" I said when he picked up. "Edith," I said when he picked up. Warm as a blanket. "Of course I remember you. How are you?" We did not speak of mortality, at least not in the way my family had. Samuel and I spoke plainly. I told him what I had heard. I told him how they tapped the cane with glee. He listened, and when he listened, I felt a small thing inside me begin to hold its shape again. "You need not be a spectacle," he said, not unkindly. "No one should talk to you as if you are a footnote." His words were practical, but not cold. There was a kind of gravity in his voice that felt like the floor settling under a house, a confidence that things can be anchored. He said nothing about revenge. He asked me about my husband's papers, about my wishes, about the house. When I answered, it felt like I was setting small bricks into a foundation I had thought too old to rebuild. Edith Grant deciding. It sounds like a simple sentence. In the moment, it felt seismic. You want to know what I did next? It began in a tidy office with framed degrees and a clock that ticked off minutes like a metronome of its own. Samuel walked me through options without giving a lecture. He did not try to make my children into monsters. He kept his language plain. We can make your wishes clear. We can ensure you have the choice of where to live. We can handle the house so you are not forced to live under other people's decisions. His hands counted possibilities on a pad of paper. He was careful not to promise me anything that was not in his power to deliver. It will take work, he said. It will take some decisions from you. But it's your life, Mrs. Grant. You have the right to decide how you spend it. Right. Decide. For a woman of my age, that word had been used like a gentle suggestion by those who decided better for me without asking. There it was, laid down like a simple, solid plank. Decide. I left his office with a folder under my arm and the jangling of coins in my pocket. Coins being not money the way children think, but the small private currency of memory and resolve. I walked home along a sidewalk that had been patched by our hands once, thinking about the roses my husband had planted, about the way the light hits the porch in late afternoon, the gulls that call as if they expect the world to keep turning. It is funny how small details come back when you are ready to take a stand. That week, I watched. I watched how people smiled and how their smiles faltered when they went out of earshot. I listened for soft plans. They did not hide them well. I stood in the hallway and heard my son say, as if rehearsing a script he had not written, "If she goes into care, we can list the house in June. It'll be easy then." Easy for whom? Easy for the one who profits, I suppose. Humiliation is a ladder with many rungs. The first is shock. The second is anger. The third is a strange, focusing sorrow that clears the mind like a hard frost. That is where I found myself. Decision on one hand, sorrow on the other. I could not undo the past. I could not return my husband to the chair he used to haunt at twilight. But I could choose how the remaining years would be lived. There are ways to fight that do not look like fighting. Dignity sometimes moves in quiet clothes. My plan was not to shatter them. It was to be lawful, measured, and precise. The part of me that my husband used to admire, the stubborn, patient part, was still there. It had felt like an ember under ash. It warmed when I leaned into it. I began small. I packed a box of photographs one afternoon, not because I would leave that day, but because handling them felt like a rehearsal for an action I might take. Each photo was a small argument for why I belonged where I was. There was the wedding photo with my husband, his grin crooked and warm. There was a picture of my daughter, not the daughter who lives with us now, but the girl who used to run through the sprinkler in the backyard. I wrapped the photographs in tissue and placed them in a box with a lid. I labeled it in my own hand, Memories. I do not like clutter. Packing small things felt like reclaiming ownership of my recollection. The house, to me, was not a title in a tax bill. It was the creak in the second stair that squeaked like a frog. The imprint on the living room carpet from where my grandson used to crash when he fell asleep on a Saturday. It was the cupboards with their uneven doors where I kept the mismatched cups. To someone else, it was an asset. Language does that. It turns tender things into numbers if given half a chance. The day I confronted them was not dramatic. I did not stand on the table and declaim like some desperate actress. I poured tea and set a biscuit on a plate. My son arrived with a watch that has more shine than its years should bear. He sat opposite me and, without looking at my face, asked casually, "Have you thought about what you want to do about the house? We were talking about it and—" I put the cup down. The clink of porcelain was loud in the small room. "I have," I said simply, "and I have decided I will not be moved without my consent." That declaration should have been enough to end the conversation. But people who have been rehearsing plans do not let one sentence rearrange their script. He smiled politely, a smile that said, "Later, we love you, Mom," but without the warmth you would expect. We were only trying to make things easier for everyone. Easier for whom? I asked that question in my head like a prayer. It is a small prayer, but sometimes small prayers bind better than sweeping ones. So I did the practical thing. I asked questions. I asked who had been talking. I asked what their ideas were. The answers were the kind that evaporate under direct light. It's for the best. We're only thinking ahead. You wouldn't want to be a burden. You call it burden, I said, tasting the word. I call it family. What you call care, I call life together. There was a pause. In that pause, the grandchildren looked up, sensing the thrum of adult tension. The daughter-in-law's fingers flexed on the table like a bird's talons. "You don't understand," my son said. "Sometimes tough choices make things simpler." Then Melissa, my daughter-in-law, laughed that thin, bright laugh. "She won't last the year," she said, as if reciting a weather forecast. "Besides, it's not like she's using the upstairs most of the time." You can imagine what those words did. I felt something inside me harden. Not anger alone, something steadier. The cane on my side felt suddenly like a spear. I left without answering because the air had become too sharp, because the best argument is sometimes the one you don't make in the heat of the moment. After that, I stopped pretending that they would change. You don't stage a quiet revolution in a single night. You plan it. You gather facts like stones for a cairn. I called Samuel again and told him exactly what had been said. He listened, and his pen scratched his pad the way he always has, slow and considerate. He suggested things I had not thought of and held back on the ones that might be too complicated or too public. Whatever we do, he said, we make it you-driven. I liked that phrase, you-driven. I liked it because it transferred movement back to me. For so long, life had felt like being carried by tide and undercurrent. Now, for the first time in a long while, I felt I could set the rudder. We met in a room with a window that looked out onto a magnolia tree. The tree's leaves were glossy, stubbornly green even in the late months. Samuel asked me about my priorities, and I answered, not in legal language, but in the language that mattered to me. I wanted two things: to be free to choose where I lived, and to leave behind a record of my wishes that could not easily be unstitched. I wanted dignity. I wanted, at the end, that the story of my life not be a quiet anecdote whispered at a dinner table. He nodded like a man remembering a sermon. "Mrs. Grant," he said, "people have underestimated you, and that will be their loss, not yours. We can make your position clear." We spoke of practicalities, but Samuel's voice never turned into a manual. He used words like trust and "my office will ensure your intent is recorded." But he said them in that measured way that promised neither miracle nor theatrics. He reminded me that the law can hold the frame if you place things correctly. I repeated the word dignity aloud like a talisman and felt something uncanny. I was no longer afraid to say what I wanted. "You will have to make some decisions," he said, "and some choices may surprise your family." "Good," I said. "Let them be surprised." It is a small thing to say, "let them be surprised," and yet when it leaves your mouth, it tastes like courage. I felt older and truer in that moment, as if the years had given me not only weight, but ballast. After the meeting, I walked along the river road where the salt air is heavy and the gulls wheel like confetti. The porch of our house looked smaller from a distance, and yet every board felt familiar under my hand. I sat on the bench by the mailbox and listened to the world. A dog barking 2 streets over, the distant sound of a boat's motor, a neighbor's radio playing a slow hymn. The cane leaned against my knee. I could have let it be a symbol of fragility. Instead, it felt like a walking stick carried by someone who still had miles to go. That night, I packed another box. This one had less memory and more intent. Important papers, my husband's watch, the small ledger where I kept notes about accounts. I did not know yet whether I would sell or move or make other changes. I only knew that I wanted my ability to choose preserved. I sealed the box and, with a quiet hand, I wrote a note and tucked it inside for Samuel to find when the time was right. "Handle with care, for my wishes." I did not tell my family about the box. I did not announce my plans on the porch with triumphant shouts. The decision to act was private and deliberate, like the drawing of a curtain when the play has ended. I was determined not to let my life be discussed as one might decide on the color of the drapes. There is dignity in the way you leave a room. The next days were a study in small gestures. I took the cane out to the garden and tapped the gravel in a pattern I liked. I rearranged the kitchen to put the things I used most within reach. I made soup and froze portions because I liked knowing there would be a bowl in the evening ready to warm me. You should not underestimate the authority found in simple preparedness. It tells you, and not anyone else, that your life will continue on your terms. At the same time, there were moments that betrayed me. A night when I held the pillow and cried for a minute, the sound wet and brief, like rain on vinyl. Grief has a way of visiting at unexpected hours. But grief does not have to be your master. I told myself that. I went to bed with the window open, just enough to hear the hush of the trees. There were glances from neighbors who had always liked my rhubarb pie. They watched me, perhaps wondering whether an old woman could outmaneuver a family. You would be surprised at how quickly people take sides in a quiet domestic dispute if you give them a hint. Some wrapped themselves in sympathy, others in practical offers to help that felt oddly like inspection. You learn to filter offers for kindness from offers for leverage. The heart grows a sort of patience for decoding motives. Samuel called to say he had reviewed some documents. He suggested we meet again. There was a pause, and in that pause I felt the shape of the next steps. He did not say, "We will ruin them." He did not promise a grand spectacle. He said, "We can make sure your wishes are honored. It will require some rearrangement, but it will be lawful and it will be clear." I remember standing on the porch, the cane steady under my hand, feeling the Atlantic wind as if it were a promise. "Make it clear," I told him. "Make it unambiguous. Make it so there is no gray where they might crawl." Samuel chuckled softly. He has the kind of laugh that is the sound of someone who has seen a good deal of life and keeps his own counsel. "We will," he said. "But remember, Mrs. Grant, the aim is not to punish. The aim is to protect your wishes." Protect. That word sounded right. The notion of protection appealed to me because it was not aggressive. It was the laying down of a boundary. I would not be a house on display with the furniture commented upon by relatives. I would not be a headline in a living room conversation. I would be a woman who had the right to make choices. Of course, words on paper do not stop whispers. People whisper as long as there is a seam to pull. That is why it matters how you place your furniture, so to speak. I sorted through accounts, found old deeds tucked away in the drawer where my husband kept his receipts. The watch, his watch, had a scratch on the back where I had once tried to polish it and left a smear. I held it and thought about time, about the difference between counting days and living them. A watch measures time, but it does not make it meaningful. You might wonder how I felt when I realized they would learn of the changes. There is a peculiar satisfaction in knowing that people who assumed they owned your future will find themselves surprised. But satisfaction is not vengeance. It is a quiet correction. The night before I was to return to Samuel's office for more particulars, I sat by the window and wrote a letter. Not a long one, not a sermon, simply a note that said, "I have not finished my story. Please respect that and do not make decisions for me." I folded the paper and put it in an envelope with his name on it. I thought about leaving it on the table where they might find it, but I remembered my husband's advice. Leave them to find things by their own conscience. Don't make them feel trapped into guilt. So I left it in my desk in a drawer marked private, and I let them read the kitchen like they were browsing a novel they would not understand. The morning of the meeting dawned clear and windless. I dressed with care. It is a small dignity to choose your clothes. I picked a blue sweater my husband liked on me and a sensible pair of shoes. I am not one for making scenes. I wanted my presence to be a statement by itself, calm, composed, unafraid. Samuel's office smelled faintly of old books and lemon oil. He greeted me with the same steady hand and the same soft eyes. On his desk lay a folder with my name, neat and waiting. "We have options," he said. "None of them dramatic, all of them within the law. You will have to tell me what you value most." When you say options, I answered, you mean I can ensure they cannot simply walk in and decide how the rest of my life looks? Yes, his voice was kind but firm. You can make plans that are hard to alter without your consent. Hard to alter. That phrase echoed. I did not want to lock my life into an unfeeling box. I wanted the freedom to change my mind later if I wished. I wanted safeguards that would prevent opportunistic adjustments. He suggested a path forward in general terms, and I agreed to move slowly but deliberately. We would make my wishes known, and we would take steps to ensure my choices could not be casually overridden by a late-night agreement over wine and impatience. He did not offer me the fantasy of perfect obedience from my family. He offered instead the mathematics of protection. Clear statements, witnesses, recorded intentions, things that show what a person wanted while they were able to speak. It was not dramatic. It was not a blade through the air. It was, to my mind, profound. To be able to speak and have the world record your speech is a kind of victory. The real triumph is not in spite. It is in the reestablishment of oneself as an agent, as someone whose preferences matter. I signed a few papers that day. They were not pages of revenge. They were pages that said, in effect, this is my choice. Each signature was a small claim staked in the land of my life. Samuel watched me with professional calm. I felt solemn as a woman laying a foundation stone. When I left his office, the sun had shifted. The magnolia's leaves flashed their stubborn green. The world seemed larger somehow, as if the horizon had been unrolled for me. I stopped at the shop on the corner for bread, and the woman at the counter said, "How are you today, Edith?" And I smiled in a way that was not practiced. Telling someone your name and having them answer kindly is an underrated kindness. That evening, when I returned home, I packed a small suitcase. Not because I intended to flee, but because I wanted to be ready. I put in a cardigan, my toothbrush, the watch, the sealed box of photographs. I left a single note in the kitchen for anyone who might look. Don't wait for me. I've chosen to go live. It was not a cruel line. It was a clean, simple declaration that my life would not be decided by whispered forecasts. I slept poorly that night, not from worry, but from an odd, vibrating anticipation. A person can spend many years in the same house and feel like a guest in her own life. The trick is to reassert ownership without making the act of ownership a proclamation against anyone. That is dignity. In the morning, I walked the driveway and tapped the cane against the gravel. The sound was steady. The gulls cried their usual claims over the river. I felt the kind of calm that comes after you have decided to speak up. People often think courage is a lightning strike. Sometimes it is a small, unglamorous turning, a phone call, a signature, a packed suitcase. I had not yet taken back everything, not in the sense that the title of this story might imply, but I had taken the first pieces. I had declared my intent, consulted a trusted ally, and begun the practical work of making my wishes known and harder to ignore. I had reclaimed for myself the simple right to decide my own fate. And yet, at the edge of the decision, you always feel the ripple. You cannot set a stone in the water without expecting the waves. I knew my family would notice. I knew they would be surprised and perhaps angry, but I had decided that my life's last chapters would be written in my hand, not dictated by gossip over pie. The day Samuel said the paperwork was in order, I felt a silly urge to sweep the kitchen. I found the broom and made small, satisfying arcs across the floor. There is an economy of action in domestic tasks, in sweeping, in folding, in making the bed. They tell the body that life continues, regardless of what other people whisper. When the mail came later that week, there was a small envelope from Samuel's office. I opened it at the table, hands steady. Inside was a letter acknowledging receipt of my instructions and confirming that the first steps had been taken to make my wishes known. The language was calm. It did not gloat. It simply recorded. As I read, I heard, like a distant murmur, the hush of my life settling into a new pattern. It was not the end of the story, not yet. It was merely the first chapter of a new kind of living, one in which I had the pen in my hand. That evening, they came by for a family dinner again. I had not invited them, but they arrived with casseroles and a confident air, as if visiting the home where they expected to be comfortably in charge. They sat at my table in familiar places and began to talk of future plans. Their words were lighter now, edged with entitlement. I listened to them while I poured tea. The cane rested beside my chair like an old friend. When Melissa reached over to tap it, a small act of mockery she thought would land like a joke, I set my hand over it. "Please don't," I said, not loud, but with a voice that had a bottom to it like a bell. The room fell into one of those thin silences where the air itself seems to be holding its breath. She pulled back, a little surprised, like a child who has been told no for the first time. Her laugh faltered. My son cleared his throat and said too quickly, "We were only joking, Mom. It's nothing." "You haven't finished your story," I said, and for once I spoke truly of myself, not in the language of grudge, but in the language of fact. "Please don't decide it for me." They looked at me, and in their faces I could read a map of expectation, disrupted. That is the uncomfortable thing about deciding for yourself. It makes other people uncomfortable. After they left, the house seemed quieter, as if it had been waiting for me to reclaim its tone. I stood on the porch and watched the cars disappear down the lane. The cane tapped the wood in a rhythm. The gulls came and went. I thought of the many small, ordinary acts that would mark my days: tending to the roses, watching late television, making dinner for myself when I wanted. Small freedoms, perhaps, but freedoms nonetheless. When the time came to move from plans into motion, I bent myself to work the way I had once bent to mend a fence or coax a stubborn rosebush back to bloom. There was no trumpet. There was only a quiet efficiency that felt strangely like prayer. Samuel and I agreed on steps that were plain and lawful. Each paper signed was a careful, deliberate assertion of my wishes. He handled the things I could not, the details none of us are meant to carry alone, and I handled the parts that were mine to do, choices about where I would live, what would happen to certain keepsakes, and how my resources should be arranged so my last years were guided by my voice, not their whispers. We chose discretion on purpose. There is power in quiet. Decisions need not be shouted from porches to be effective. They need only be honest, witnessed, and recorded. The house was appraised, a buyer found who respected the place and its tender history. The sale went through with no curtain-raising fanfare. I remember the closing day as a paper-blurred morning, the porch light pale, the sky a gray that felt polite and non-committal. Samuel drove me to the office. He parked under the magnolia, and for a moment we sat without speaking. He took my hand with a steadiness that communicated more than his words ever did. "You have done this well," he said. "You kept your center." I do not know that I felt brave. I felt precise. I felt like a woman who had finally, after years of being cataloged and classified, placed her own book on the shelf with her name on it. The keys were handed over, the paper signed. The sound of shoes on linoleum as the buyers left was ordinary and final. No trumpets, no gloating. The house, which had been at once cradle and battleground, changed hands in the most ordinary way possible. The proceeds from the sale did not disappear into a drawer. They were placed exactly where we had discussed, into arrangements that would secure my comfort for as long as I needed and preserve the things I wanted preserved. I do not mean to be cryptic, but details can become instructions if spoken aloud too plainly. What matters is that the course was lawful, deliberate, and oriented to protect my agency. Samuel called it putting a fence around the wishes, and I liked the image. Fences can be good and necessary when they hold back what would otherwise trample tender things. News travels slower than you think when it is not given to those who expect it, and faster than you expect when it is a rumor about change. My family noticed the change in the house first. Some of the familiar things were no longer there. Boxes labeled memories gone, like small ceremonial acts of detachment. They came by because people who have been rehearsing entitlement tend to make house calls with the assumption of approval. They found the rooms arranged differently, the photographs wrapped and stored, the ledger gone. Questions came at me in a tide. Where did the papers go? Who did you speak to? Did you consult someone about selling? I answered simply and calmly. I spoke with Samuel. I made choices I am comfortable with. That is almost always the end of it for anyone who has not been taught to take everything as their right. For those who have been taught otherwise, the answer is a wound. Samuel, who is nothing if not circumspect, suggested a meeting where the matter could be explained. He said it in that low-key way he has, the kind of voice that suggests you might expect to be disappointed by the messenger, but nonetheless will get what you need to hear. He invited my children to his office, citing important updates to the estate file. I imagine they expected a routine read-through, possibly a quick formality that would reassure them the house, if sold, would leave some manageable legacy. I imagine they pictured a check or a new plan their way. They arrived in a cluster, my son with the shiny watch, Melissa with her practiced expression, a daughter-in-law who has made a career of being breezy when it suits her and instructive when it doesn't. They sat in the waiting room as if in an airline lounge, confident they had the right seat. It is remarkable how certain entitlement makes people comfortable in spaces they do not own. Samuel called them into his office one at a time, as if he were reading names from a list. He is civilized in a way that can be disarming. I sat in the back where the light from the window painted the room with a patient glow. I did not want theatrics. I did not want to watch them suffer for the sake of a show. I wanted them to hear the truth with the dignity I had insisted upon giving myself. The conversation was quiet. Samuel explained the facts, the sale of the property, the establishment of arrangements for my care and comfort, the designation of beneficiaries for certain items that mattered to me. He read the statements I had insisted upon, that my choices were made in full capacity, that the instructions reflected my wishes, that they were recorded and witnessed. His voice did not rise or fall with drama. It maintained its steady compass. There was a moment, a small, unremarkable pause, when faces changed. I watched my son's fingers tremble as they curled around his knee. Melissa's laughter, if you can call it that, was swallowed like a draft. You could see it in the set of their mouths, the quick dabbing at eyes they were not ready to admit had turned wet. We are not actors in a play where the applause is required. We are people who must reckon with the consequences of our choices. In that office, consequences arrived as silence. They asked, very quickly, the kinds of questions people ask when they expect a different answer. Why? Who told you we wouldn't? What about the children? Samuel answered each question with the same calm, reiterating the facts, reminding them their attempts to manage my life were precisely the reason the safeguards existed. He did not make it personal beyond the facts. He had been tasked with protecting my decisions, not with humiliating them. There was a thin edge of pleading in Melissa's voice when she spoke, and I recognized it for what it was, the sound of someone who had been slowed down by a reality that did not bow to her assumptions. "We never wanted you to suffer," she said, trying to shape this into a reassuring parable. "We just wanted what was best." "You can define best," Samuel said, "but we have a record of what Mrs. Grant defines." He handed them a copy of the documents, not to shame them, but because the law will tell its story in writing, and sometimes people need to see the text to believe it is real. My son's face was a geography of surprise and a dawning comprehension. They had counted on a future emptied of difficulty and filled with inheritance. The future they had planned depended on my absence as a fact to be scheduled. When that assumption evaporated before a quiet piece of paper and a listener's ear, the ground under their plan gave way. You might imagine that anger swelled, that accusations flew. There was a flash of it, a tone raised, a phrase like, "You can't do that, Mom," offered as if words could change deeds. But even anger, when it is practiced as entitlement, can be frail when measured against the solidity of someone's carefully made decisions. The loudest push is often only noise. Samuel's office was a place of stillness where the noise had nowhere to lodge. "I didn't do this to hurt you," I said later, when my son and Melissa left with a slammed car door and a jittery silence. I stood on the porch watching them go. The gulls wheeled, their cries seemed to mark the moment like punctuation. I did it because I do not want someone else to pick the last chapters of my life. The weeks that followed were quieter in some ways and edgier in others. My children kept up a stream of calls that were at first curious, then testing, then thinly apologetic. They brought casseroles without the old ease, offers that smelt to me like perfumed tests. I accepted some, refused others, always in the tone of someone who had regained the right to choose. I did not gloat. There was no delight in seeing entitlement humbled. There was only the severe sweetness of relief. I moved, as I had planned, into a small cottage not far from the water. It is modest and tidy and has a stoop that looks over the salt marsh, where at dusk the sky burns orange and then cools into undemanding blue. My furniture is pared down, the chair my husband used to doze in, the lamp that used to sit on the side table beside his paperbacks, my modest dishes. The cane leans by the back door, its paint worn in the place where my palm grips it. I have a kettle that whistles with the sort of cheerful insistence that feels like a companion. But the first mornings were odd in their gentleness. I would sit on the porch and watch boats putter by like sleeping toys. The gulls kept time with the tide. Without the tension that had lived in the house for months, I could feel little things return. The taste of coffee in the morning that is not acutely flavored by worry. The sound of children playing in a neighbor's yard that no longer sounds like an interrogation of my future. One afternoon, Samuel came by with a slice of pie and sat on the stoop with me. He drank his tea and watched the river. "You have taken back everything," he said. And he did not mean marble or diamonds. He meant what the title of this story promises, the ability to direct the remaining arc of your own life. "You were clear about what you wanted preserved," he added, and I felt once more that curious buoyancy, not triumph, but a kind of rightness. You must understand that what I took back was not only legal control. It was the quiet reclamation of being allowed to continue with my habits and my small rituals without commentary. It was the removal of the sense that other people could reasonably decide when I had had enough. When you reach a certain age, you are too often viewed as a boat that has been condemned to drift without a helmsman. To steer was always my simple ambition. To steer and be allowed to steer is what I reclaimed. Word of my move reached the grandchildren. They arrived one afternoon with a box of sunflowers, large heads bobbing like small suns. I opened the door and there they were, shuffled, earnest, a little unsure how to be grandchildren without their rehearsed posture. We made tea. One of them, the youngest, put his head on my lap and fell asleep as if the world were still safe. I felt something inside my chest warm the way an old oven warms bread. The children did not inherit malice. They inherited confusion sown by the adults around them. To them, I am still the grandmother who reads too loudly and sneaks extra cookies. Melissa did not come to the cottage at first. There was a silence, a distance. Perhaps pride is a heavier thing than most realize. My son came later, awkward and small in his apologies. He brought a jar of homemade jam and a look that tried on contrition and found he could not make it fit. We talked at length about small things, the taste of their father's stew, the way our neighbor used to whistle. We skirted the sharp things, as adults often do when they are afraid of the edges of conversation. He left with a hug that had been practiced and a promise to visit more often. Promises, I have learned, are weather. Some hold, some do not. I did not hinge my peace on keeping track. You might wonder if there were regrets. Of course. There were many evenings when the radio hummed in the other room, and I wished, briefly and tenderly, that some of the old tenderness had been different. But regret is not ownership. I can regret and still choose how I want to live now. The distinction matters. There were practical delights to my new routine. I bought a kettle that fits the stove like it was made for it. The whistle of that kettle is now a small song I know by heart. I watch the tide change, and I measure my days by things that have nothing to do with accounts or calendars. I walk with the cane along the boardwalk and greet the same faces. They nod. People who have known you for a while become mirrors that help you remember who you were. One evening, not long after the move, I sat on the porch under a sky the softest indigo. The sea smelled of iron and salt. I had a thin shawl over my shoulders and my husband's watch on the table beside me. Samuel called, as he often did now, not with business, but with the companionship of a man who had watched one of his clients reclaim herself. "How does it feel?" he asked. It felt, I told him, like arriving after a long journey and recognizing the bed as my own. It felt real and ordinary and entirely mine. There is a kind of prayer that is not syllables, but life arranged to reflect how you want it to be lived. I do not pretend that this is an instructive tale in the sense of blueprints and how-tos. I would never offer legal recipes. The law is a tool, and a tool should be used with care and counsel. What I will say, and I hope you hear it not as arrogance, but as testimony, is that there is a dignity due every person, no matter the number of their years. That dignity can be protected through law and can be embodied by the simplest acts. Keeping a packed box of photographs, writing a note that states your wishes, signing papers that record your choices. These acts are small and they are powerful because they declare who you are. There were, of course, moments of sadness that lingered. The holidays bring a peculiar ache. They are reminder and ritual so tightly braided that one loosening of a string can make the whole pattern fray. I invited people in when I wanted to. When I did not want company, I declined. I learned to say no with a softness that did not betray my firmness. People, even family, do not always like boundaries. But boundaries are part of dignity. They mark where you end and the world begins. I have been asked by friends and by strangers who have heard snippets of my story whether I felt cruel. The answer is simple and it is true. No. I felt measured, I felt humane in a way that is not the same as being soft on the world. Cruelty is a pleasure taken from another's wound. The actions I took were designed not to wound, but to preserve. If preservation sometimes surprises those who expected to inherit a life, that surprise is a consequence of assumptions they had built without my consent. There were letters after the move. Some were conciliatory, some defensive, some wrapped in the pleasant varnish of concern. One letter surprised me, a short note from my granddaughter that said simply, "Grandma, I like your new porch." That is all. It was everything. On a clear morning, I walked down the path to the beach with my cane tapping the boards. The sun was just rising, a clean line of light. I watched the horizon open like a promise. I thought of my husband's habit of saying, "Edie, life is stubborn in the way it keeps asking to be lived." I sipped my tea and listened to the call of the gulls. The world, as ever, was indifferent to petty dramas. It also, as ever, held room for quiet joy. If there is a moral in this tale, it is not that one must outmaneuver one's children or that one should distrust kin. It is that you must claim the right to be the author of your own days. If others would write your ending before you have read the last chapter, then you must, with all the lawful means at your disposal, set the margin straight. There is nothing unloving in that. It is an act of stewardship, of the self. I will close with something small and ordinary, a cup of tea clinking against the saucer, the cane tapping in time with my breath, the gulls as chorus. I am not triumphant in the cartoonish sense. I am simply living the way I choose to live, with a quiet steadiness I have not known for a long time. My house is different. My days are gentler. My dignity is intact. If this true story from North Carolina touched something in you, if it reminded you of a moment when you took your life back or wished to, tell me below. Say where you're watching from and share one small act of courage you've taken or are thinking about taking. Your stories steady me, and they help other women feel stronger. If you don't want to face these battles alone, subscribe to Mature Justice. Here, we share real stories of dignity, strength, and women reclaiming their lives on their own terms. Like and share this video with someone who needs to remember they still hold the pen. And if you have your own story, even a short one, write it in the comments. I read them, and they keep me steady.